All right. Welcome to the Dynamic Competition Initiative podcast, the podcast that explores the dynamism and complexity of economic systems. Our mission at DCI is to develop and advance innovation-based dynamic competition theories, tools, and policy processes adjusted for the nature and pace of innovation in the 21st century for the benefit of society and the maintenance of an open, democratic, liberal order. Today's guest is Professor Frederick M. Scherer. Professor Scherer has had a long and distinguished career in the field of industrial economics. He was particularly instrumental in the development of the economics of technological change, as well as the areas of antitrust and competition policy, where he served as the chief economist for the US Federal Trade Commission from 1974 to 1976. For more information on Professor Scherer's career and scholarly work, we'll make it available on our website at dynamiccompetition.com. Thank you for sharing your time and insights with us today, Professor. My pleasure. Great. My name is Bo Hayden, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Dynamic Competition Initiative, run as a joint effort between the European University Institute and UC Berkeley. I currently split my time between UC Berkeley and Chalmers and Gothenburg University in Sweden. My colleague for today's interview is Natalia Moreno Baloso. Natalia is a PhD researcher in law at the European University Institute in Florence. All right, we'll get going. It seems appropriate to kick off a discussion on dynamic competition with Joseph Schumpeter. One goal we have at DCI is to better understand and operationalize Schumpeter's economic insights. So we would like to start off with your thoughts on Schumpeter and the historical treatment of innovation and dynamism in competition policy. Over to you, Natalia.
Thank you, Bo, and thank you, Professor, for being on the call today. It's a real pleasure. And as Bo said, I'll start right off with Schumpeter, and in particular something that Schumpeter is often associated with: the hypothesis that large firms and monopoly positions are ideally suited for introducing technological innovations, the so-called Schumpeterian hypothesis or Schumpeterian thesis. And this thesis features heavily in the wealth of secondary literature that has been written on Schumpeter. But some commentators have argued that this thesis is not Schumpeterian at all, and that it is a misreading.
Say it again, please. Say something some arguers have argued, and I didn't get the rest of the sentence.
So some have argued that the thesis is not Schumpeterian at all, so that it is a misreading of Schumpeter's work, that saying that Schumpeter meant that large firms and monopoly positions are particularly well suited or particularly conducive to introduce technological innovations, that is a misreading of Schumpeter. And the origins of this misreading or misinterpretation, as they claim that it is, they trace back often, at least in part, to your work, Professor. And instead of interpreting Schumpeter as having said that large firms are more innovative than small ones, they interpret him
large firms are more what?
Innovative.
Innovative.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry. Then small ones, they interpret him as having said, for instance, that innovation leads to market power rather than the other way around, or saying that the key innovator in Schumpeter's writings is not the large firm, but the entrepreneur. And I was wondering what your view is on the existence of these varying interpretations of Schumpeter, which at times even conflict with each other. Do you think they can be somehow reconciled into one Schumpeter, one reading of Schumpeter?
I'm not sure you can reconcile Schumpeter. There are 100 Schumpeters, and he's a lot of different things, and those different things can be interpreted in different ways. And the world about which he was speaking has changed, and all those things lead to a reinterpretation of the articulations that Schumpeter announced. So
okay.
If I'm a Schumpeterian, I'm a confused Schumpeterian.
So then, to follow up on that, would you then say that the conversation has has spent too much time on this question of on what Schumpeter may or may not have meant to say about which firms innovate best or innovate more. Has the debate perhaps overshadowed some of Schumpeter's other contributions, such as his dynamic evolutionary approach to competition?
Well, two things about that. First of all, it's an historical question, and it is likely to be decided in part only by historical research, of which there has been a great deal, with conclusions that differ depending upon the particular study that has been taken. So one has to be very careful about assessing the so-called historical empirical literature about Schumpeter. And second, the questions are at bottom quantitative questions, and they can be illuminated by quantitative research. That quantitative research has, as nearly as I can tell, has only begun. And to be honest, I have not followed it in detail, but there have been a number of studies recently that have tested diverse iterations of the Schumpeterian hypothesis with different results. And I must say I've not followed that literature closely, so I can't cite chapter and verse.
All right, thank you. Because I was wondering about because there is a lot of literature on the monopoly versus competition question, and which was more conducive to innovation. But as you said, this historical research now should be assessed from that historical context. So one should be careful when doing that. So then there is still value is there still value, according to you, to revisit that question, if I understand correctly? So the question about so the different iterations of the Schumpeterian hypothesis or thesis, like different formulations of that, there's still value in looking at that.
Well, yes, indeed. And I find myself changing my views on what Schumpeter implied frequently as I go back and juxtapose the evidence against what he said. I come out not knowing for sure what he did say, because the evidence is contradictory.
It does.
But the other important thing to understand is, especially in the context of the United States, is that our attitudes towards innovation and the role that large Schumpeterian firms play in innovation has changed in a big way over time, partly as a result of policy changes.
All right, thank you. And it does prove indeed tricky to try to find out what Schumpeter said or didn't say, and it is easy to change your mind on that.
Let me pop in for a second, Mike. What these changes? How is this the change that you just mentioned? How have you seen these changes? How has it impacted? There's an empirical understanding, but then there's a kind of political spin on what you see, right? In response to your invitation, I did a small survey of the history of the Schumpeterian thesis, and the whole thesis about the role of monopoly existing and as a goal, as a reward for technological innovation. And I found that the history is quite a long one. There has been, for several centuries, there has been a strong movement that says that monopoly is a bad thing for technological innovation. And there have been a group, if you want to call them Schumpeterians, you could, even though Schumpeter didn't exist at the time,
There are those who argue that a high concentration of effort was a good thing. And you see the historical record is very incomplete and inconsistent. For example, at the time of King James, the successor to Queen Elizabeth of England, the Statute of Monopolies was passed. And that was all about granting patent monopolies. And there was a great debate over whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. And it was finally decided that in response to a limited set of rights in a particular sphere of invention, a monopoly, a patent monopoly would be a good thing to encourage technological progress, but it was to be severely limited, and that was what the Statute of Monopolies did. It limited the grant of these monopoly rights to true inventions for a limited period of time, and therefore greatly conscribed the effect of the granting of patent monopolies on the impact on the economy.
Would you say that it's better to try to, we talk about trying to measure competition, but if social welfare, in total, or if, as Schumpeter would talk about, this innovative output that comes is the most important, is it better to try to understand whether how innovation is taking place as a primary variable to look at, instead of only looking at size or number of competitors in a market structure?
Well, both of those are important. The latter in a short run sense, the former in a long run sense. It's very, very clear that technological innovation has dominated the contours of economic history for many, many centuries. You can see that, among other things, in the recent book that Joel Mokyr has published. I forget what the title of it was something like 10 Centuries of Technological Change. But it's a complex subject, and Schumpeterian monopolies or patents, or whatever you want to call them, play a significantly positive role, but it's a role that is also greatly exaggerated and frequently attacked. And if you look at the history of the Schumpeterian debate, when the structure of the American economy changed in the 19th century, the late 19th century, and we had the era of trustification, there was a great deal of debate as to whether these big trusts were desirable for technological progress, and there was an outright attack on the patent system for giving unneeded monopolies for innovations that would have come about even without the patent grants. So there was a very strong anti-patent movement in the late 18th century as the American era of trust busting began. And then what got me interested in this was what happened in the 20th century. In the 1930s, when the United States and the world experienced the severe recession, some of that was blamed on a retardation of technological progress. And there was intense criticism of the role of monopolies in building big patent portfolios and holding back progress and retarding the growth of the economy. That gave rise to the existence and then a series of reports from the so-called Temporary National Economy, TNEC, Temporary National Economic Committee, and it was that period was very, very anti-Schumpeterian. And if you look at the congressional history, there were attacks in Congress on the extensiveness of the patent privilege, and there was an intensification of antitrust actions against monopolization through technological innovation. It was a very, very anti-monopoly period, the 1930s. And then I came along and had firsthand experience, but during the 1940s, there were a large number, 100 I counted, more than 100 I counted, a large number of actions by the U.S. antitrust authorities against concentrations of patent holdings and their monopolistic effects. And there was a lot of litigation. And during this period, the practice of compulsory patent licensing under antitrust treaties became common and extensive. And this was, in a sense, a very anti-Schumpeterian period. And it was during that period that I began doing research on the patent system, but very much influenced by the congressional hearings and the actions that were going on, and I did a major statistical study of the effects of these interventions on technological change and the patent portfolios of U.S. companies and so forth. There's a large literature that's summarized in my book. I don't know if you came across it or not. Patents and the Corporation, which was published in first edition 1958, second edition 59.
Yes,
but again, in terms of public policy, there were times when Schumpeter was very much in the ascendance, and there were times when he was very much criticized and his principles were ignored.
I think we might be witnessing some of that anti-Schumpeterian or anti-monopoly sentiment today as well. I wanted to
well, yes, indeed. Well, it continued for quite some time, and indeed today there's a resurgence of it well, there are the resurgences of two forms. One, there's a generalized repulsion against the use of intellectual power by the large corporations under the patent laws. But second, unlike previous periods, we have very rich data, and there's been an ascendance of statistical research on the market structure, its impact on technological innovation, the consequences of technological innovation for market structure, and we're in a whole new era in terms of developing evidence.
Natalia, sorry, I break in for just a second to let you go. What's interesting there, Professor, is that the patent system, as you first said, is that why should we give people patents, because they already have other control positions, market power mechanisms that they can use, so it's redundant or unnecessary. On the other hand, you have companies.
We weren't nearly as sophisticated in the 18th, 19th century about that question.
Right. And then, of course, the idea that the smaller, the more entrepreneurial actor with a patent, like Samson with the sling is possibly one of the only chances to compete against bigger actors that have other market power positions. So it is a kind of interesting discussion how it's swerved back and forth based on this kind of monopoly power thinking, and what is the role? Is patents good for this? In which people's hands is it necessary? All this has gone back and forth.
Well, the debate, in fact, has continued, and it took a new form, which had its origins in the work of Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber in France in the, it would have been 1960s, Le Défi Américain. And the argument with Schreiber was it was by forming powerful corporations, the Europeans could counteract the technological leadership of the giant American corporations. And there was a conference at Fontainebleau in I think it was 1960. No, it was in the 70s, I think. And another conference in Bonn, Germany, about it. And there came out of this, and it was a basically Schumpeterian idea. There came out of this the notion that governments should cultivate national champions who would be large firms with a powerful market position who could spend money on research and development and make innovations. This this movement towards national champions was very strongly opposed in parts. I was at both the Bonn and the Fontainebleau conference, and there were quite a few representatives at both conferences from the group associated with Chris Freeman at the University of Sussex in England, and they were bitterly critical of the national champion idea and thought that this was a wrong way to go, that they should let 100 flowers bloom and encourage the widespread development of innovative approaches. So this has been Schumpeter is at that sort of lying in the background in this debate, but this has been a major debate in the post-World War II era. And out of this came, too, an American development in which, in a sense, I was a witness. That is the rise of the independent high-technology venture company, which originated with the American Research and Development Corporation, founded in 1946, and has spread throughout the Western world, so that now the champions of technological innovation are relatively small startup firms with venture capital funding that came out of that movement.
And Schumpeter didn't see.
It's been a totally changing environment over time.
Right, and Schumpeter didn't see the dawn of the venture capital industry, so he missed that. Natalia, please go ahead.
Yes, so I wanted to change focus for a bit and focus on instead of on the question of monopoly, on the question of the dynamic approach to competition policy and antitrust, which is a theme throughout much of your work, where you've argued that industrial economics should take on a primarily dynamic approach. Yet, static analysis has generally dominated in addressing antitrust issues. And I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on what may have been barriers to a welcoming of dynamic analysis in competition policy. Is the issue that courts have been ill-equipped to adjudicate the complex technological trade-off questions that a dynamic assessment calls for, or have there been other factors at play?
Well, there's always been a back and forth among policymakers on this. And my impression would be that there was a relatively favorable attitude towards aggregations of power for the purpose of affecting technological innovations some decades ago. And right now, the pendulum is strongly swinging against such aggregations of power, partly because of the success of venture capital firms. But this is a very complicated question and continues to be at the forefront of the debate. But I think by and large, the United States at least is tipping towards more emphasis on independent competition in technological innovation and less emphasis on consolidations and groupings and joint ventures and the like. I've definitely seen that trend since, say, the 1950s.
All right. Just checking with Bo.
Let me just add one thing. And this is, for me, it's important. I don't know whether it's important for policymakers. But when I started working in this field in the 1950s, it was really hard to get data. The main data that were available were patent data. The Census Bureau had data on, it collected surveys on company research and development spending, but they were very, very confidential. Mm-hmm. And a group of us scholars labored to make these data available to scholars. And now I've been retired fully for 8 years now, and I'm sort of out of touch with the current literature. I do not subscribe to current economics journals. I believe there have been quantitative studies published recently on this, but I have not seen them. But in any event, these studies came out of the attitude of economists that these data should be made available on a confidential basis for bona fide scholars. And you can go in and do all kinds of studies of the relationship between research and development spending, technological innovation, and market structure. And not only can you do it, but it has been done. I've been pretty much out of the field lately, but I know it is being done and making a contribution to knowledge.
We're going to come back to that about how to measure.
Actually, let me just do a little bit of self-horn tooting.
Okay.
I was on a National Science Foundation committee that actually opened up the group that collects such data, opened up to bona fide external scholars. And indeed, here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we have a branch of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which has a direct computer connection to the Census Bureau, where studies are done on precisely these kinds of questions. It's a very much, it's a very much more favorable environment for doing research on the kinds of questions that interest you. I knew long ago that you needed such data. And I remember it was back in the 1960s trying to convince the director of the Industrial Census, Maxwell Conklin, that he should make his data available to scholars. And he was just adamantly against you. There was almost a license for being shot in the Census Bureau, but it changed and it's happened. We're really in a different environment.
I think that
knowledge-wise.
I think that this information, as you say, is critical to understanding what's going on, because a lot of it is, in the black box, so to speak. But it's difficult, I guess, today in 2021 to argue that data isn't critical to answering important questions, since almost all businesses are based on it. So maybe things will open up more will have more ability to understand this, and how it changes over time, I think, is important. But I'll get back to measurement in just a second. I wanted to ask you a little bit of a polemic question about the Schumpeterian thinking. If Schumpeter is correct about dynamic competition being much more important than static competition, then in that these big changes that come across society, wiping out the old, replacing them, is a much bigger phenomena, and the rest is basically tinkering in between. What is the relevance of antitrust, or even economists in the Schumpeterian world, where these big cycles of change come and happen under their own volition? How do we see the role of antitrust tinkering around in between these big waves of creative destruction?
Well, antitrust still plays a role, but I think the role it should be playing, and it's trying to play, is to keep technological market structures more open and let 100 flowers bloom, because out of those 100 flowers are going to be some pretty powerful flowers. I have seen this take place over time, and I think it's taking place now. I've been out of the business fully for about 8 years now, but I definitely see this attitude taking hold, and I think we're better off for it with as much access to scientific data as possible, and we have to factor in the venture capital industries, which, as I mentioned before, is not so long ago innovation, but these things keep us as a dynamic economy and make us a more dynamic economy. The venture startup industry is just terribly important. It's been life-changing.
How do we see these two boundaries? Maybe I'm curious about the boundaries. On one hand, people say, well, if you have a large monopolist that can set prices, and it doesn't have any incentive to cannibalize itself, others can't come in and create change, that the market structure in that way would reduce innovation. And I think you, in your 2007 paper, you talked about how that might have been so, I think in AT&T's case, because every time someone came to compete, they sped up their development. But then on the other hand, perfect competition is not a world where you get a lot of innovation either.
Oh, certainly not.
So you have so we're trying to manage this kind of world of in between, where it's just the right amount of competition, where competition produces innovation, innovation creates competition. How do you kind of dial that in as a policymaker?
Well, I don't think you could dial that. I'm not that kind of policymaker.
Right.
You can encourage it, right. And we do encourage it in many ways in the United States with our venture capital industry, with various research and development subsidies for startup companies, and with the training that we give our university engineering graduates. We do encourage it quite vigorously, I think, and I think we've been largely successful.
Natalia, I think we're going to ask Mike one more question on Schumpeter before we let him go on that.
Yes, so one final question on Schumpeter indeed. So you already said it yourself, you're a bit of a confused Schumpeterian. The label Schumpeterian has featured in some of your titles, even your collection of papers, Innovation and Growth, Schumpeterian Perspectives. In the introduction to that, you also declared that you continue to be Schumpeterian in the most fundamental sense. So the use of the label brought to mind similar labels often invoked in antitrust. You have Chicagoan, you have Brandesian, and you have Neo-Brandesian. And sometimes these are used in self-description, sometimes pejoratively. And I was wondering whether the use of the label has influenced in any way that you might suspect how your work has been received.
I don't think very much. Well, you say your work. You mean my work, I think.
Yes.
I don't know. It may, But my work is not everybody's work, and people's nomenclature varies widely. And I think that we have essentially accepted that the best thing is to let 100 flowers bloom and provide vigorous research and development support both to small businesses and larger businesses. We do that. We're doing pretty well. Now, I hate to be overconfident. There are lots of areas where we're falling through, but I think we've learned our lessons. The days when I can remember, I was horrified. The conference at Fontainebleau, which was, I think, 1975, I was horrified at how much the government was trying to steer industrial technology. Same thing was true in Germany at the conference in Bonn. But the people, the business community has reacted very badly to this, and I think the Germans and French are doing pretty well. But it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle, and the struggle continues.
I think that has been a bit of the issue in the United States, where some people would argue that we don't, industrial policy, the government shouldn't pick winners, shouldn't decide. On the same hand, the government has been involved in developing a lot of basic technologies. Obviously, the reaching the moon, for example, was a government project that generated a lot. DARPA initiative, the government buys a lot of technology. The military, for instance, spends what, $700 billion a year.
Military is rather different for the most part from civilian, but yes, there certainly is more military intervention than civilian intervention. But on civilian, we're in pretty good shape, I would say.
Let me move on to some of the more contemporary questions. Natalia just spoke a little bit about the neo-Brandeisians, and so recently there, which is everywhere on the news, the government is seeking to step up investigation and regulation in response to what it believes is a high concentration of market power in the economy, and what they often define as a historically lax antitrust environment based on a too narrow concept of consumer welfare, or what they often call the Chicago School. Have you followed this new discussion, these neo-Brandeisian perspectives? I know Lena Kahn wrote an article about Amazon and the
well, you sent me a Lena Kahn article. I have followed a few things she's written, but I'm not a big Lena Kahn follower, but I'm not a big follower of anybody. I'm 89 years old. I retired fully and cut back my library severely in 1985. But yes, this debate continues to go on. But I have the impression that those who want to push government control and guidance of technological change have lost ground relative to those who believe that 100 flowers should bloom, and that the free and open market should decide what will be innovated and what will not be innovated. It's really been a change. I mean, the change, the situation now is very different from what the situation was, say, in France, when they were. I'm trying to remember who the author was who argued for French government. Let me see. I can't think of it now. But there was a lot more movement, academic support for very strong government intervention in the private technological economy. It's still there for military and space, but a lot more support 30 years ago than there is now, because we learned.
So when antitrust
Servan Schreiber was the défi américain. He was the person who motivated the Fontainebleau conferences in 1965.
When the antitrust authorities look at certain cases nowadays and they try to figure out whether a merger should be allowed, or they look at the situation of market power in a certain industry or a certain market, what is the principle that you think they should use? I mean, part of the argument from Bork was that you should use a consumer welfare perspective, which there's even controversy. I believe he meant total welfare perspective. Nowadays, the neo-Brandeisians think more, they bring in privacy issues and democracy issues and other issues. So where do you see the line on how where antitrust should step in to facilitate to let all flowers bloom, as you say, and where should other regulatory instruments be used to look at other issues?
Antitrust should be encouraging 100 flowers to bloom. Directed efforts, yes, they're good, but diversified, seemingly random efforts directed by perception of market forces, they are very good too, and I think both should be doing that. Let me say something about antitrust. Well, I wanted to say something about Xerox. During the period that I've been actively alive as a professional, I would say antitrust has become more focused on maintaining competition in research, development, and innovation than in giving out monopoly franchises in the same area. Xerox would be a good example. We had a major antitrust suit against Xerox at the Federal Trade Commission starting around 1970. I was there as the director of one of the units in the mid-70s. On the Xerox case, we had a problem. Xerox was doing some good work technologically. Xerox was very complicated technologically. The government's people, especially the government's economists, really didn't understand quite what Xerox was doing. And I was at the Federal Trade Commission when they tried to shape their technological monopolization suit against Xerox. And frankly, the staff were lost. They just couldn't get a picture of things and get a hold of the facts in such a way as to act forcibly. I saw this. I saw that the case was going nowhere. And in this case, I had a remedy. I had come a few years earlier from the University of Michigan, where we had, among other things, traditions. We had maintained the tradition of qualitative and quantitative industry case studies. And one of my students, Irwin Blackstone, Irwin teaches at Temple University now, one of my students at Michigan, Irwin Blackstone, had done a very, very thorough qualitative especially, but also quantitative study of Xerox's technological innovations. I gave the Federal Trade Commission staff a copy of Irwin's dissertation. They were amazed at all the little strategies Xerox had to maintain exclusivity of their technology and prevent others from making significant innovations on that technology. The case with Irwin's assistants moved in the direction of opening up Xerox's technology so that there was more room for different companies to exercise technological activity. The results were absolutely marvelous. You can read about them. There was a book, let's see, I have it here, I think, somewhere. David Kearns, Kearns. David Kearns was the author. I can't find it now. Kearns, Kearns, and the other author was Nadler, Reinventing Xerox. And those two, both of whom were chief executive officers of Xerox during this period, tell what a marvelous, enlivening effect the antitrust actions had on Xerox's choice and development of various technologies, and the results were very salutary. The results of good knowledge of what the possibilities were and what the possibilities for competition were, they led to competition that greatly advanced the technological art of xerography. Kearns and the book title was Reinventing Xerox. I had it here, but for some reason I don't have it anymore.
Xerox is an interesting case, and I think that's one I see that you would recommend that we might want to look at from an innovation perspective.
Well, definitely. That's the case where, A, the antitrust staff just proves ill-informed to tackle the technological issues, but thanks to the dissertation, which was done by a very good case study-oriented economist, thanks to that intervention, they understood and took actions which led to an acceleration of technological progress in xerography. Kearns and Nadler, they were former CEOs. And the title of the book, I think, was Reinventing Xerox. I have it written down here somewhere, but I can't find it now.
So that leads me to how, because you talk about the inability to understand the situation in the Xerox case. How do you feel that policymakers nowadays, do they have the theories? You know, the theories are basically the glasses that you wear to see the world. So if you're not wearing the right glasses, you see something, but not the right thing. And then, as you mentioned before, the data, if you're looking at the right thing, can you have the data to understand it? Do you feel that in this rather dynamic world, especially now as innovation accelerates, that the policymakers have the tools to be able to manage this process,
Well,
not dial things in, but oversee and govern things?
We know about the data.
Yeah.
We have achieved better access to the data. We have developed methodologies that allow us to find out what's going on in particular industries. We can use how well we're using those methodologies to improve performance. I do not know. I've been out of this business for at least a dozen years, and I just don't know what we've done more recently. But yes, the tools exist theoretically. Yes, they exist in the real world. The big challenge to the enforcement agencies is A, getting access to the relevant data, that's possible, and B, having a staff that is amenable to doing the kinds of analysis that are needed. And
I like when you state it like A and B like that, it seems kind of easy.
Whether we're doing that in some of the other pending antitrust cases, I simply don't know. I'm out of the picture.
No, that's
take Google, take Facebook. I just don't know enough about what we're doing to know whether we really understand what we're doing.
Fair enough. I mean, that's the focus for our work as well. We just wanted to get your thoughts from your experience over time, because this different policy and the political movement of, as you say, what do people do given certain tools? So do we lack the tools, or do we lack the initiative to use them? Is it political? Is it economic? What's the issues? These are the things that come back over time.
Yeah, all of that is difficult to get together, but we can do it.
So let me ask you a little bit about measurement, because I know you've talked about that a lot already, and I know you've written a lot about that, and I read a lot of your work in that area, and the measurement of innovation. Now, Saulo kind of pointed out to us the extent of our ignorance, and that technology change and innovation was really at the center of the economic universe. But it still has taken a while for people to put technology change and innovation at the center of mainstream economics. What is this have a lot to do with this inability to measure it in a good way, in your opinion?
I don't think so. I think we're just not trying hard enough. We know how to measure. You just have to put in a lot of effort, and not very many people do it. Why don't they do it? Well, the data are, I've fought all my life to get access to various kinds of data. The data tend to be hard to get, but you can do it if you push hard enough. Mm-hmm. And the ideas need to be there. I have pushed my graduate students to go after the relevant sources of data. I haven't taught a graduate student for nearly 15 years, a research graduate student. I don't know whether they're doing it now or not. Certainly, we can do it. I know from experience we can do it. I saw what Irwin Blackstone did. I've seen what others of my students have done with quantitative data. I know we can do it.
Very good. So one of the things I was wondering, what are the limitations maybe of patent information and trying to understand the big picture of innovation? I was reading your working paper.
Limitations of innovation in China, did you say?
No, using patents to try to understand innovation. So if you tried to look at the number of patents, I know that you did an analysis in one of
I've done a lot of it, but they're an imperfect measure. They can achieve certain things. You need more. You need qualitative information about what's being worked on. You need information on what the innovations are doing for productivity, for availability of consumer products. You need a whole lot more than simply patents. Although patents help. Right. Patents help. The more measures you have and the better you use them, the more you're going to know.
No, I think because when you use, as you know very well, the value of patents are skewed with some of your work, and of course so many patents don't matter at all. They're not used at all. Some are just very incremental. Well, some can be radical and make huge differences. So it's hard to just count them and know whether something's happening in a certain, what type of innovation is taking place, so to speak.
Well, let me make a fundamental point, which I've made this throughout my career, signaled it at certain stages. The outcome of innovative effort is very skewed. A few efforts are fantastically successful in achieving economic success, market success, and so forth. The majority just bumble along and make small contributions. One needs to recognize the problem of skewness and develop numbers that measure the distribution and especially penetrate the high value part of the outcome frequency distribution. That's been done. It should continue to be done.
In this kind of Schumpeterian competition, the one that destroys an industry and builds a new one, you're not going to find necessarily that very easily in the patent information of the industry you're looking at. So you're not going to find in the horse and buggy patents the coming of the automobile. And So
I might have found it 100 years ago. I don't find it today.
All right. I know you meant one more set of questions for you, Professor. And I know that Natalia wanted to ask something that you mentioned, you brought up already. She wanted to know about method, right? Case studies and issues. So, Natalia.
Indeed, I already heard you touch upon case studies, upon historical research in today's interview. And on other occasions, you've already lamented the demise of the case study tradition. So industrial economists and economists in general no longer seem to do these in-depth studies of a certain industry. And what for you is the value of doing such case studies? And why do you think this type of historical research has fallen out of fashion in economics?
Well, number one, we clearly do less of that than we used to do. Number two, we do some. Number three, economics, as in particular PhD programs, are not really oriented towards doing qualitative and in-depth case studies. They're more inclined towards analyzing large databases. Number four, there are exceptions, and people are doing very good exceptions. So Erwin Blackstone, for example, did a very, very in-depth qualitative case study of Xerox's strategies and innovative histories. That's for most economists. That's not routine. That's not what they do. I think we need more of it, and that will come from their teachers. Their teachers have to recognize it. Well, the one thing it'll come from their teachers. Their teachers have to recognize it, but also the antitrust agencies, the FTC and the Department of Justice, employ a lot of economists. I think they should consciously be put to work, each or most, not full-time, 100%, but each one should have in the background some kind of case study and be working on it. I remember when I became director of the Bureau of Economics, I mandated that everybody do a case study. There was a lot of grumbling at first, but it produced very good results.
And is there a specific industry, a specific case study that you have at the top of your mind, where you would direct a young PhD student looking to better understand dynamic competition and technological change? Is there a specific one you have in mind?
Oh, it's let's see. Well, I was chief economist of the Federal Trade Commission, 1975. It's 45 or so years from now. I don't have exact memory. I do know that we focused our inquiries often quite well, but I don't have exact memory of where we focus them. We should be doing, economists working for antitrust agency staff should be doing two things. They should be putting together quantitative databases that illuminate the main dimensions of what it is they're concerned about: price competition, qualitative competition, and the like. And they should be developing the occasional case study that illustrates a key point.
I think that's good advice. Can I ask you about that? I think you have already given us assignment, Professor, to dig in more into the Xerox case. Can I ask you just a quick question about that, since you were there? It was at a good time, I think.
What is the time we're talking about?
During your time when the Xerox case. I think
I was there from 1974 to 76.
One of the issues with the Xerox case is it's similar to nowadays. it's not necessarily national champion thinking, but still the idea that companies that are strong in the United States need to remain strong because of geopolitical competition. I know that some have mentioned that the antitrust actions against Xerox allowed for the Japanese to come in and take over the industry, and that had a negative effect. Nowadays, we talk about having companies that are strong in the U.S. and should we have antitrust actions against them, but aren't they the strong companies that we need to compete against the Chinese, for example? Going back to the Xerox case and this geopolitical competition, do you have any insights on that?
Going back to the Xerox case, what's the second?
You were saying before that the Xerox case turned out to be rather good for Xerox, and in this case study, even the people at Xerox were saying how this helped to increase innovation. But some people criticize.
Oh, indeed, yes. The book by Kearns and Nadler is really is an important evaluation of what good antitrust can do.
I was just curious if you had any recollection about some of the criticisms that this allowed for the Japanese industries to take over xerography and compete more heavily against American companies. And
that was good. The interventions with respect to Xerox, among other things, brought the Japanese more actively into the U.S. market. The Japanese forced Xerox to improve its quality, and it had an overall beneficial effect. I don't look at it in Machiavellian terms that we want to keep the Japanese down.
No.
Let 100 flowers bloom.
There just seems to be now a modern discussion around similar issues between the U.S. and China and technology competition. Natalia, did you have any follow-up questions for Professor Scherer?
One final one, perhaps. So we've talked quite a bit about what we would like to see economists doing in terms of research. Is there anything what type of research would you like to see legal scholars doing in antitrust, in competition policy? Is there anything you think that has been missing over the years in what legal scholars bring to the table?
Well, I've been out of it for some time, and I am not up to date, especially on the quantitative studies of market structure changes, and changes in competition indicators. I think that research, which I believe does continue, should continue and be aggressively pursued. I think, however, in terms of emphasis, there should be more emphasis on individual case studies, on the nitty-gritty of particular cases, how competition policy can or cannot make a difference. The Xerox case, again, is illustrative. When I came to the Federal Trade Commission in 1975, I ordained that each, what did they call them? We had one division, I forget its name now. It was basic industry analysis, it was called. Each industry analysis staff member should undertake to perform over the next 3 years a study of some particular industry. I wanted them to get their hands dirty, get out in the real world and find out what was going on. That was not very popular, but they did it and it had good results.
All right, that's it for my questions, I think. So, Bo, do you have any follow-ups?
I think that was a good way to end because that's very good advice.